Hello there, fellow night wanderers. Welcome to another journey into the sleepy side of history. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe as we explore these ancient stories together. And if you enjoy drifting off to sleep to the gentle hum of history told in hushed tones, be sure to subscribe. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. The blazing Egyptian sun beats down mercilessly on limestone blocks the size of houses. The Nile stretches endlessly toward the horizon, its muddy waters reflecting the brutal heat. Palm trees sway in the distance, and somewhere, workers chant in rhythm as they haul massive stones across the desert sand. This is ancient Egypt, land of pyramids and mummies, of golden treasures and mysterious hieroglyphs. But tonight, we're not here to marvel at the wonders. We're here to talk about what it was really like to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Because while Hollywood might have sold you on the glamour of being a god king, the truth is far more complicated, far more lonely, and frankly, far more terrifying than you might imagine. You see, being a pharaoh in ancient Egypt wasn't just a job. It wasn't even just being a king. You were supposedly a living god, the earthly incarnation of Horus, destined to become Osiris upon your death. Sounds impressive, doesn't it? Divine power, unlimited wealth, subjects who worshipped your every word. But here's what they don't tell you about being a god. Gods don't get to have bad days. Gods don't get to make mistakes. And gods certainly don't get to be human. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that thousands of people are depending on you to literally keep the sun rising. Not metaphorically, literally. In ancient Egyptian belief, if the pharaoh failed in his divine duties, if he displeased the other gods or performed the rituals incorrectly, the sun might not rise tomorrow, the Nile might not flood, the crops might fail. Chaos would return to swallow the world. That's a lot of pressure for anyone, let alone someone who might have inherited the throne as a child, as many pharaohs did. Picture being 10 years old and being told that you're not just responsible for governing millions of people, but for maintaining the cosmic order itself. Every decision you make, every word you speak, every gesture you perform in the elaborate daily rituals, it all matters. One wrong move and you're not just a bad king. You're the person who broke the universe. And speaking of those daily rituals, let's talk about what a typical day actually looked like for a pharaoh. You might imagine sleeping in on silk sheets, perhaps a lazy breakfast served by beautiful servants, maybe some time to enjoy your vast wealth. But number two, a pharaoh's day began before dawn with ritual purification. You were awakened by priests who would bathe you, dress you in the proper ceremonial garments, and prepare you for the morning's religious duties. Every single day, without exception, you had to perform a series of complex rituals to ensure the continued functioning of the universe. This wasn't optional. This wasn't something you could delegate or skip if you weren't feeling well. The fate of Egypt, and indeed the world, depended on these ceremonies being performed correctly by you, personally, every single day. You would enter the inner sanctum of the temple, where only you were allowed to go and perform the ritual awakening of the gods. You would wash their statues, dress them, offer them food and incense, and recite the proper prayers. Every gesture had to be perfect. Every word had to be pronounced correctly. Every offering had to be precisely the right type and amount. Because these weren't just statues you were tending to, in Egyptian belief, these were the actual gods themselves, present in their earthly forms. And the gods, as anyone familiar with ancient mythology knows, could be remarkably petty and vindictive when displeased. Make an error in the ritual, and you might find yourself dealing with plagues, famines, or military disasters. The pressure was absolutely crushing, but the religious duties were just the beginning of your daily nightmare. You were also expected to be a brilliant military commander, leading Egypt's armies into battle against neighboring kingdoms and rebellious provinces. Never mind that you might have no military training or aptitude for warfare. Never mind that you might be physically frail or more intellectually inclined. You were the Pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, the warrior god, and you were expected to personally lead your troops into combat. Consider the Pharaoh Tutankhamun, who died at around 18 years old. Recent forensic analysis of his mummy suggests he died from injuries sustained in battle, possibly from a chariot accident during a military campaign. Here was a young man, barely out of childhood, thrust into the role of divine king and military commander, ultimately dying in service to expectations he never chose and probably never wanted. And if the military duties weren't enough, you were also expected to be the ultimate judge and lawgiver for your people. Every major legal dispute, every important decision about trade or diplomacy, every question about taxation or resource allocation, it all ultimately came back to you. The buck, as they say, stopped with the Pharaoh. But here's the cruel irony. Despite being worshipped as a god, despite having theoretically unlimited power, pharaohs were actually some of the most constrained and controlled people in all of Egypt. Your daily schedule was dictated by religious obligations. Your clothing, your food, even your personal relationships were all governed by strict protocols and traditions. You couldn't simply decide to take a day off and go fishing on the Nile. You couldn't choose to eat whatever appealed to you. You couldn't even choose your own spouse. Marriage for pharaohs was a political tool, used to cement alliances, legitimize claims to the throne, or maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. Love, personal preference, compatibility, these were luxuries that gods simply couldn't afford. And let's talk about that royal bloodline for a moment, because this is where things get particularly disturbing. To maintain the divine nature of the pharaoh's bloodline, royal marriages were often kept within the family. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, uncles married nieces. This wasn't considered unusual or wrong. It was considered necessary to preserve the divine essence of the royal family. But as we now know, such close inbreeding led to serious genetic problems. Many pharaohs suffered from physical deformities, mental disabilities, and shortened lifespans as a direct result of generations of incestuous marriages. King Tutankhamun, for example, had a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and numerous other physical abnormalities. His parents were likely brother and sister. The pharaoh Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's probable father, is depicted in artwork with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and other unusual physical characteristics that may have resulted from genetic disorders caused by inbreeding. These weren't artistic stylizations. They were likely accurate representations of a man whose divine bloodline had become a genetic curse. So not only were you expected to be a perfect god king, you were quite possibly dealing with serious physical and mental health issues that made performing your duties even more challenging. And you couldn't seek help or show weakness because gods don't have limitations. Gods don't get sick. Gods don't struggle. The isolation was perhaps the worst part of all. Surrounded by people every moment of your life, yet utterly alone. Everyone who approached you had an agenda. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every smile was calculated. You could never be certain if people liked you for who you were or feared you for what you represented. Your own family members were often your greatest threats. Brothers, sisters, wives, children, all potential rivals for the throne. Palace intrigue was a constant danger. Poison in your food, daggers in the dark, conspiracies whispered in shadowed corridors. Many pharaohs died not in glorious battle or peaceful old age, but murdered by those closest to them. Queen Hatshepsut, one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, likely died from poison. After her death, her successor attempted to erase her from history entirely, chiseling her name and image from monuments throughout Egypt. Even in death, pharaohs couldn't rest easy, knowing that their enemies might try to destroy their chances of reaching the afterlife by obliterating their memory from the world. And speaking of death, let's consider what happened when a pharaoh's reign finally ended. You might think that death would bring relief from the crushing responsibilities and isolation of divine kingship. But even in death, pharaohs faced unique horrors. The mummification process, while intended to preserve the body for the afterlife, was a gruesome procedure that could take up to 70 days. Your brain was removed through your nose with a long hook. Your internal organs were extracted, preserved separately in canopic jars. Your body was packed with natron salt and left to dry out completely before being wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages. But the physical preservation was just the beginning. Your tomb, no matter how well hidden or protected, would likely be robbed within a few generations. Grave robbers didn't just steal your treasure, they destroyed your carefully preserved body in their search for hidden valuables. And in Egyptian belief, if your body was destroyed, your soul couldn't reach the afterlife. All those years of divine duty, all that suffering and sacrifice, and you might still end up wandering as a lost spirit for eternity. Even the Great Pyramids, those magnificent monuments that still inspire awe today, were ultimately failures at their primary purpose. They were meant to protect the pharaoh's bodies and treasures for eternity, but virtually all of them were plundered in ancient times. The pharaohs who commissioned these incredible structures, who devoted vast resources and countless lives to their construction, ended up just as robbed and desecrated as those buried in simpler tombs. So there you have it, the reality behind the golden mask and the double crown. Being a pharaoh meant living as a prisoner of your own divinity, crushed under the weight of cosmic responsibility, isolated by power, threatened by family, and ultimately, quite possibly, denied even the peaceful afterlife you'd spent your entire existence trying to secure. The next time you see those magnificent artifacts in a museum, those golden burial masks and ornate sarcophagi, remember that they belong to people who lived lives of unimaginable pressure and loneliness. People who were worshipped as gods, but who lived as prisoners of their own divine status. But we're just getting started on this journey through the gilded nightmare of ancient Egyptian royalty. In the coming parts, we'll explore more of the daily horrors that awaited those who wore the crown of the pharaohs, the political intrigue, the religious obligations, the constant threat of assassination, and the bizarre rituals that governed every aspect of royal life. For now, though, let the weight of these ancient burdens settle gently into your mind as you drift towards sleep. Let the desert winds carry away the day's worries, and rest easy knowing that whatever pressures you face in your modern life, at least you're not responsible for keeping the sun rising every morning. Sweet dreams, and we'll continue our exploration of pharaonic misery in the next installment of this ancient tale of power and its terrible price. Why it sucked being a pharaoh in ancient times, boring history for sleep. Part 2. Before we dive deeper into tonight's journey through ancient Egypt, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're in right now and what time it is where you are. There's something wonderfully connecting about knowing we're all drifting through history together, no matter how far apart we might be. And if you find this style of gentle historical storytelling helps you unwind and drift off to sleep, consider subscribing. We have many more soothing tales from the past waiting to lull you into peaceful slumber. Now, let's return to the banks of the Nile, where we left our divine rulers trapped in their golden cages of expectation and ritual. You might think that once you survived the crushing weight of daily religious obligations, the constant threat of assassination, and the bizarre marriage arrangements we discussed earlier, being a pharaoh would start to get easier. Perhaps you imagined that with all that divine power, you could at least eat well, sleep comfortably, and enjoy some basic human pleasures. You would be wrong. Even the most mundane aspects of royal life were governed by suffocating protocols that would make a modern diplomatic dinner seem refreshingly casual. Take, for instance, the simple act of eating. You couldn't just wander into the kitchen and grab a piece of bread. Every meal was a choreographed religious ceremony, complete with specific prayers, ritual washing, and carefully prescribed foods that had been blessed by priests and tested by food tasters who lived in constant fear of both poison and divine retribution. The pharaoh's diet wasn't about nutrition or pleasure. It was about maintaining cosmic balance. Certain foods were forbidden during certain seasons. Others could only be consumed while facing specific directions, and some required elaborate purification rituals that could take hours to complete. You might spend more time praying over your dinner than actually eating it, and heaven help you if you accidentally consume something that violated the complex dietary laws governing divine rulers. Even sleep, that most basic human need, was transformed into an ordeal of supernatural proportions. The royal bedchamber wasn't just a room where you rested. It was a mystical space where your soul traveled through the underworld each night, battling demons and navigating the dangerous waters of the afterlife before returning to your body at dawn. Priests had to perform protective rituals around your bed, burning specific incenses and chanting prayers to ensure your safe passage through the realm of the dead. The bed itself was more like a religious artifact than furniture, covered in sacred symbols and oriented according to astronomical calculations. You couldn't simply lie down when you were tired. You had to wait for the priest to determine the most auspicious moment, based on the positions of the stars and the phases of the moon. Sometimes this meant staying awake until the early hours of the morning, exhausted but unable to sleep because the cosmos wasn't properly aligned. And when you finally did drift off, you couldn't enjoy the simple unconsciousness that comes with ordinary sleep. Royal dreams were considered prophetic messages from the gods, requiring immediate interpretation by teams of dream analysts who would wake you the moment you stirred to record every detail of your nocturnal visions. Imagine never being able to have a private thought, even in sleep, because every random dream image might be dissected for cosmic significance. But perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of genuine human connection. The divine status that supposedly elevated pharaohs above mere mortals also isolated them in ways that would drive most people to madness. You couldn't have friends in any meaningful sense. Every person who approached you wanted something, whether it was political favor, religious blessing, or simply the reflected glory of being near divine power. Even your closest advisors and family members viewed you first as a god and second, if at all, as a human being. Conversations were formal, ritualized affairs where every word was carefully chosen to avoid giving offense to your divine nature. No one could laugh at your jokes unless they were sure it was appropriate. No one could offer genuine criticism or honest advice because contradicting a god was blasphemy. No one could simply sit with you in comfortable silence because every moment in your presence was considered sacred time that had to be filled with proper worship and ceremony. The loneliness was profound and inescapable. You were surrounded by hundreds of people every day, yet you might go years without a single authentic human interaction. Everyone who spoke to you was performing a role, following scripts that had been developed over centuries to properly address divinity. The weight of this isolation often drove pharaohs to seek connection in increasingly desperate ways, Some turned to alcohol or other substances, seeking escape from the suffocating formality of their existence. Others became obsessed with their pets, the only creatures who might show them unconditional affection without hidden agendas. Many developed elaborate fantasy relationships with their gods, spending hours in private conversation with statues and sacred objects, desperately seeking some form of genuine communication. The psychological toll was enormous. Historical records suggest that many pharaohs suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. But in ancient Egypt, these weren't seen as medical conditions requiring treatment. They were viewed as spiritual failings, signs that the pharaoh wasn't properly fulfilling their divine role. This meant that seeking help or even acknowledging psychological distress was impossible without admitting to religious inadequacy. Some pharaohs tried to rebel against these constraints in small ways, but even minor deviations from protocol could have catastrophic consequences. There are records of rulers who attempted to eat meals in private, only to face accusations of impiety from the priesthood. Others who tried to conduct business without full ceremonial dress were warned that they were endangering the cosmic order. The system was designed to crush any expression of individual humanity in favor of maintaining the divine performance. The irony was that this same system that supposedly made pharaohs godlike also made them remarkably powerless in many practical ways. While they theoretically had absolute authority over the kingdom, they were so constrained by religious obligations and ceremonial requirements that they often had little time or energy for actual governance. Many important decisions were made by priests and bureaucrats, while the pharaoh was occupied with the endless rituals required to maintain cosmic balance. This created a strange dynamic, where the person with ultimate theoretical power was often the least free person in the entire kingdom. A common farmer could choose when to eat his meals, where to sleep, and how to spend his leisure time. A pharaoh couldn't make any of these decisions without consulting priests, astronomers, and religious texts to ensure cosmic compliance. The physical toll of this lifestyle was equally devastating. The constant stress of performance, combined with the health impacts of elaborate ceremonial makeup, heavy ceremonial clothing, and ritual scarification, meant that many pharaohs aged rapidly and died young. The lead-based cosmetics used in religious ceremonies caused neurological damage. The heavy golden headdresses and jewelry led to chronic neck and back problems. The ritual fasting and elaborate dietary restrictions often resulted in malnutrition, even among the wealthiest people in the kingdom. But perhaps most tragically, many pharaohs seem to have internalized these constraints so completely that they lost any sense of who they might have been without them. Born into this system from infancy, raised to believe that their every action had cosmic significance, they often became unable to imagine existence outside the rigid framework of divine protocol. They weren't just trapped by external expectations, they had become psychologically incapable of conceiving of themselves as anything other than divine performers. This psychological conditioning was so complete that even pharaohs who intellectually understood the artificiality of their situation often couldn't bring themselves to break free. They had been so thoroughly trained to equate their personal worth with their successful performance of divinity that any deviation felt like spiritual suicide. The golden cage wasn't just locked from the outside. Many pharaohs had internalized the locks so completely that they couldn't imagine wanting to escape. The few historical accounts we have of pharaohs attempting to live more normal lives are heartbreaking in their desperation and ultimate futility. These were some of the most powerful people who ever lived, yet they were often less free than the slaves who served in their palaces. The slaves, at least, could dream of freedom. The pharaohs had been taught that freedom itself was a cosmic impossibility, that their divine nature made normal human existence not just unattainable, but spiritually destructive. And so they performed their roles, day after day, year after year, until death finally released them from the burden of divinity. Whether that release led to the glorious afterlife they had been promised, or simply to the peace of non-existence, at least it meant an end to the exhausting performance of being a god among mortals. As we continue our exploration of royal Egyptian misery, we'll discover that even in death, the pharaohs couldn't escape the crushing expectations and elaborate protocols that had defined their lives. But for now, let your mind drift away from these ancient palaces of golden imprisonment, where even gods weren't free to be human. The weight of the crown was more than gold and jewels. It was the weight of eternity pressing down on mortal shoulders that were never meant to bear such burdens, and in that crushing pressure, perhaps we can find a strange comfort in our own ordinary lives, where we're free to eat when we're hungry, sleep when we're tired, and be human without cosmic consequence. Rest now, knowing that your dreams are your own, unobserved by priests and uninterpreted by cosmic analysts. In sleep, at least, we are all free from the burden of divinity, and that freedom is perhaps the most precious gift of all. Before we dive deeper into tonight's exploration, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're in right now and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the globe for these sleepy journeys through history. And if you enjoy this style of content for drifting off to sleep, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to help you ease into peaceful slumber. Now let's continue our journey into the golden prison that was pharaonic life. If you thought the daily religious obligations were exhausting, imagine trying to maintain divine perfection while your own body was systematically destroying itself from within. Because here's the thing about ancient Egyptian royalty that the golden masks and pristine tomb paintings don't tell you. The pharaohs were some of the most physically compromised people in all of Egypt. The royal bloodlines, you see, were kept pure through a practice that modern genetics would call catastrophic, systematic inbreeding. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and cousins married cousins, generation after generation, in an endless cycle designed to keep divine blood undiluted. The result was a royal family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a telephone pole. Take Tutankhamun, the boy king whose golden burial mask has become the face of ancient Egypt. Recent DNA analysis revealed that his parents were likely full siblings. His body, preserved for over 3 millennia, tells a story of genetic devastation. He had a cleft palate, a club foot, pronounced overbite, and suffered from multiple bone disorders. His spine was curved, his ribs were malformed, and he likely required walking sticks just to move around his palace. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday for Egyptian royalty. Akhenaten, the revolutionary pharaoh who briefly transformed Egyptian religion, is depicted in art with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and an overall appearance so unusual that scholars still debate whether he suffered from Marfan syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or some other genetic condition. His daughters, born from his marriage to Nefertiti, show similar physical abnormalities in their artistic representations. Queen Hatshepsut, one of the most successful female pharaohs, likely suffered from diabetes and arthritis so severe that she needed increasingly powerful pain medications. Chemical analysis of vessels found in her tomb suggests she was using a primitive form of cannabis-based medicine just to function through her daily royal duties. But the physical suffering was only the beginning, because maintaining divine status meant that these ailments had to be hidden, explained away, or reframed as marks of divine favor. A pharaoh couldn't simply be sick. They had to be temporarily indisposed by the weight of cosmic responsibility, or perhaps suffering a divine test that would ultimately strengthen their connection to the gods. The royal physicians, the most skilled medical practitioners in the ancient world, found themselves in an impossible position. They had to treat conditions that couldn't officially exist in patients who were supposedly immortal. Medical papyri from the period show treatments for everything from chronic pain to depression to fertility issues, but always couched in language that avoided suggesting the Pharaoh was anything less than divine. Consider the daily reality of Rameses II, known as Rameses the Great, who ruled for 66 years and lived to be around 90. By the end of his reign, he was severely arthritic, had lost most of his teeth, suffered from atherosclerosis, and was likely in constant pain. Yet he still had to perform the daily temple rituals, receive foreign ambassadors, and project an image of divine strength and vitality. His mummy reveals the desperate measures taken to maintain appearances. His nose was stuffed with peppercorns and small animal bones to maintain its shape. His skin was packed with sawdust and natron to prevent further deterioration. Even in death, the illusion of perfection had to be maintained. The psychological toll of living with these conditions while maintaining divine status cannot be overstated. Imagine chronic pain that you can never acknowledge. Imagine physical limitations that must be hidden from your subjects, your priests, your own family. Imagine the constant fear that any sign of weakness would be interpreted as a loss of divine favor, potentially triggering rebellion or invasion. Pharaohs developed elaborate strategies to hide their infirmities. They wore increasingly heavy makeup and elaborate headdresses to mask facial deformities. They adopted formal, stylized poses for public appearances that concealed mobility issues. They surrounded themselves with loyal servants who could help them maintain the illusion of effortless divine grace. But perhaps most tragically, they often turned to increasingly dangerous treatments in their desperation to maintain their physical capabilities. Mercury-based compounds for skin conditions, lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned them, opium-derived pain medications that led to dependency. The very treatments meant to help them fulfill their divine duties often accelerated their physical decline. The female pharaohs faced additional challenges. Hatshepsut bound her breasts and wore a false beard to maintain the masculine image associated with pharaonic power, likely causing chronic back and breathing problems. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was rumored to test poisons on condemned prisoners, possibly in search of a painless way to end her own suffering if her political situation became untenable. The children of pharaohs grew up watching their parents struggle with these hidden ailments, knowing that the same fate likely awaited them. They saw divine beings who were supposed to be perfect slowly deteriorating behind closed doors, maintained by an army of physicians, servants, and courtiers sworn to secrecy. Some pharaohs died young, possibly as much from the stress of maintaining divine perfection while physically falling apart as from their actual medical conditions. Others lived long lives of carefully managed suffering, their every public appearance a performance of health and vitality they didn't actually possess. And through it all, they had to continue performing the complex religious rituals that legitimized their rule, standing for hours in temple ceremonies when their joints screamed in protest, participating in elaborate festivals when they could barely walk, leading military campaigns when they needed assistance just to mount a horse. The irony was profound. The very practices designed to keep the pharaonic bloodline pure and divine were systematically destroying the physical vessels meant to house that divinity. The gods, it seemed, demanded perfect servants from fundamentally imperfect human material. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can appreciate the simple luxury of acknowledging when you don't feel well, of seeking treatment without political consequences, of living a life where your physical limitations don't threaten the cosmic order. The pharaohs, for all their gold and glory, never had that freedom. They lived and died as prisoners of their own supposed divinity, their bodies crumbling inside shells of gold and lapis lazuli, maintaining the illusion of perfection until their final breath. Even then, the mortuary priest would work for months to restore the appearance of divine health to their mummified remains, ensuring that even in death, the fiction of pharaonic perfection would endure. Sleep well, knowing that your humanity is not a burden to be hidden, but a condition to be embraced. But perhaps the most insidious nightmare of medieval romance wasn't found in the physical dangers or social constraints we've explored. No, the deepest horror lay in the realm of the mind, where love itself became a form of madness that could consume you from within, leaving you questioning not just your feelings, but your very sanity. Picture, if you will, a young woman named Isabel, living in a small village in 14th century France. She's 17, which by medieval standards makes her practically an old maid, having somehow avoided the typical fate of marriage at 14. But Isabel harbours a secret that fills her with both ecstasy and terror. She believes herself to be deeply, passionately in love with the local priest. Now, in our modern world, we might recognise this as a simple crush, perhaps complicated by the forbidden nature of the attraction. But in medieval times, such feelings were viewed through an entirely different lens. Isabel doesn't just worry about social scandal or religious impropriety. She genuinely fears that her passionate feelings are evidence that she has been possessed by demons, that her very soul is being corrupted by dark forces beyond her control. This wasn't paranoia. This was mainstream medieval thinking. The church taught that intense romantic or sexual desire, especially when directed toward inappropriate targets, was quite literally the work of the devil. Love, particularly passionate love, was seen as a form of spiritual sickness that could drive people to madness, violence, and eternal damnation. Medieval medical texts described what they called amor heroes, or heroic love, which they classified as a genuine mental illness. The symptoms they listed included loss of appetite, sleeplessness, obsessive thoughts about the beloved, and what we might now recognize as depression or anxiety. But rather than treating these as normal, if perhaps intense, human emotions, medieval physicians saw them as evidence of supernatural interference with the natural order of the mind. The prescribed treatments were as brutal as they were ineffective. Bloodletting was common, based on the theory that passionate love was caused by an excess of hot blood that needed to be drained from the body. Patients might be purged with powerful laxatives, subjected to cold baths, or forced to take herbal concoctions that were often more poison than medicine. In extreme cases, exorcism might be performed to drive out the demons thought to be causing the unnatural desires. But the psychological torture didn't end with the medical establishment. The very structure of medieval society was designed to make romantic love feel like a form of madness. Consider the impossible situation faced by most young people. They were expected to marry for practical reasons, to partners chosen by their families, often people they barely knew. Any feelings of genuine attraction or affection for someone else were not just discouraged. They were seen as evidence of moral corruption. This created a world where perfectly normal human emotions had to be hidden, suppressed, and constantly examined for signs of sinfulness. Young people learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest feelings as potentially evil. The constant self-monitoring and self-doubt this required was psychologically exhausting, creating a population of people who were afraid of their own emotions. The fear was made worse by the medieval obsession with signs and omens. Every unusual dream, every moment of distraction during prayer, every flutter of the heart when seeing an attractive person could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. People lived in constant fear that their thoughts were being monitored not just by their neighbors and religious authorities, but by invisible forces of evil. The concept of romantic melancholy, which would later become a fashionable literary trope, had its roots in this medieval understanding of love as madness. But in its original form, it wasn't romantic at all. It was terrifying. To be afflicted with intense romantic feelings was to risk being labeled as mentally unstable, spiritually corrupted, or even possessed by demons. Women, as always, bore the worst of this psychological burden. Any woman who displayed too much passion, who seemed too interested in romantic matters, or who appeared to enjoy physical pleasure, risked being accused of everything from nymphomania to witchcraft. The line between being seen as passionate and being seen as possessed was razor thin, and crossing it could have deadly consequences. The medieval mind also struggled with the concept of consent in ways that created additional psychological torment. In a world where marriages were arranged and women had little say in their romantic lives, the distinction between desire and duty became hopelessly blurred. Women were expected to submit to their husbands' desires, while simultaneously being warned that enjoying such submission was sinful. Men, meanwhile, were taught that their sexual desires were both natural and dangerous, leading to a kind of constant internal conflict. This psychological confusion was made worse by the medieval understanding of the humours. According to this medical theory, which dominated thinking for centuries, human personality and behaviour were controlled by 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Romantic passion was thought to be caused by an excess of hot, wet humours, which could literally drive a person insane if not properly balanced. The treatments for humoral imbalance were as unpleasant as they sound. Patients might be bled, purged, forced to vomit, or subjected to extreme changes in diet and environment. The idea was to restore balance to the body and mind, but the treatments often left patients weakened, confused, and even more psychologically unstable than before. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way medieval society treated those who were diagnosed with love madness. Rather than receiving sympathy or support, they were often shunned, mocked, or worse. Families might disown children who displayed signs of inappropriate romantic attachment. Communities might exile those whose behavior was seen as threatening to social order. The psychological pressure created by this system was immense. Young people learned to hide their feelings so thoroughly that many lost touch with their own emotions entirely. They became experts at pretending, at performing the roles expected of them while burying their true selves so deeply that even they forgot what lay beneath the surface. This emotional suppression had consequences that rippled through entire generations. Children raised by parents who had learned to fear their own emotions grew up in households where genuine affection was rare, where love was expressed through duty rather than feeling, where the very foundations of healthy relationships had been poisoned by centuries of religious and social conditioning. And yet somehow, love persisted. Even in this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, people continued to fall in love, to risk everything for moments of genuine connection, to believe that somewhere beneath all the rules and restrictions and supernatural terrors, something beautiful and true could still flourish. But they paid a price for that persistence. They lived with constant anxiety, always wondering if their feelings were real or if they were being deceived by forces beyond their understanding. They questioned every emotion, analyzed every thought, searched for signs of corruption in their own hearts. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval romance. In a world that claimed to value love as a divine gift, the actual experience of loving was transformed into a form of psychological torture. The very emotions that should have brought joy and fulfillment instead became sources of fear, guilt, and self-doubt. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, in your warm bed in your quiet room, spare a thought for young Isabel, lying awake in her cold medieval cottage, wondering if the feelings in her heart are a gift from God or a curse from the devil. Wonder what it would be like to live in a world where love itself was seen as a form of madness, where the deepest human emotions were treated as symptoms of disease. And perhaps, as sleep takes you, you'll find yourself grateful for the simple freedom to feel what you feel, to love whom you love, without fearing that your very emotions might damn your soul or drive you mad. Because in the end, that may be the greatest gift our modern world has given us. The right to trust our own hearts, even when they lead us into uncertainty. The medieval world was indeed a nightmare for those seeking love, but their courage in loving anyway, despite the psychological torment and supernatural fears that surrounded them, perhaps makes their stories all the more poignant and profound. Before we continue our journey through the brutal realities of pharaonic life, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment letting me know what corner of the world you're in and what time it is for you. If you find this kind of deep dive into history's darker corners helps you drift off to sleep, consider subscribing. We have many more forgotten stories waiting to be told. Now, let's return to the scorching sands of ancient Egypt, where even the most powerful beings on earth lived lives of unimaginable constraint and suffering. Part 5. The Gilded Prison of Divine Performance. The morning ritual began before dawn, as it always did. In the pre-dawn darkness of the royal chambers, a pharaoh's day started not with rest or contemplation, but with the exhausting theatre of divinity. Every gesture, every word, every breath had to be perfect, because the pharaoh was not merely a king, he was a living god, and gods, the priest reminded him daily, do not have bad days. Picture Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most celebrated rulers, awakening not to birdsong or gentle sunlight, but to the soft chanting of priests who had been preparing his divine transformation since midnight. His body, already aching from the previous day's ceremonies, would be lifted from his bed not by servants, but by men who believed they were handling the physical form of a deity. The cleansing ritual alone took hours. Every inch of the pharaoh's skin had to be purified with sacred oils, each one blessed and consecrated. His teeth, often rotting from the honey-sweetened foods that comprise the royal diet, were cleaned with natron and aromatic herbs. His nails were trimmed and polished to perfection. His hair, what remained of it after years of wearing the heavy ceremonial crowns, was oiled and arranged. But this was not mere grooming. This was the daily transformation of a mortal into a god, and every step was watched, judged, and recorded by the priests who held the pharaoh's divine legitimacy in their hands. The makeup ritual was particularly elaborate. The iconic black kohl that lined Egyptian eyes wasn't just decoration, it was armor against both the harsh desert sun and the expectations of divinity. But for the pharaoh, even this simple act became a ceremony of profound spiritual significance. The kohl had to be applied in precisely the right patterns, with brushes blessed by specific deities, while priests chanted hymns that had been unchanged for centuries. Red ochre for the lips and cheeks, ground malachite for the eyes, gold dust mixed into creams to give the skin a supernatural glow. Each cosmetic had religious significance, each application a prayer. The pharaoh's face became a canvas upon which the priests painted divinity, but beneath the paint was often a man whose body was already beginning to rebel against the demands placed upon it. Ramesses II, who ruled for 66 years and is remembered as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, left behind a mummy that tells a different story than his magnificent monuments. His body shows evidence of severe arthritis, likely from decades of standing in rigid ceremonial poses for hours at a time. His spine is curved from the weight of the heavy ceremonial crowns. His feet are deformed from years of wearing the symbolic sandals that marked his divine status. The pharaoh's clothing was not chosen for comfort or practicality. Every garment was a religious symbol, every ornament a declaration of divine authority. The false beard, made of precious metals and often weighing several pounds, had to be strapped to the chin for hours during ceremonies. The elaborate headdresses, some weighing as much as 20 pounds, caused chronic neck problems and headaches that lasted for days. The crook and flail, the iconic symbols of pharaonic power, were not lightweight ceremonial props. They were heavy, awkward instruments that had to be held in precisely the right positions for hours during religious ceremonies. The pharaoh's arms would cramp, his shoulders would ache, but he could not move, could not shift position, could not show any sign of human weakness. Even eating was a performance. The pharaoh's meals were not about nutrition or pleasure, but about maintaining the fiction of divine perfection. He ate foods that were symbolic rather than healthy, honey-laden dishes that rotted his teeth, rich meats that clogged his arteries, elaborate pastries that satisfied religious requirements but left his body malnourished in crucial ways. And he ate alone, always alone, because gods do not dine with mortals. Even his wives, his children, his closest advisors could not share his table. Every meal was a reminder of his isolation, every bite taken in the crushing silence of absolute power. The pharaoh's every movement was choreographed, every gesture rehearsed. He could not scratch an itch during a ceremony, could not yawn during lengthy religious recitations, could not show pain even when the heavy ceremonial regalia cut into his skin or when illness racked his body. To be Pharaoh was to be a living statue, beautiful and perfect and utterly inhuman. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine never being able to express genuine emotion, never being able to admit weakness, never being able to simply be human. The pharaoh lived in a world where every relationship was defined by his divine status, where every conversation was filtered through layers of protocol and religious significance. Even his most intimate relationships were performances. His marriages were political alliances blessed by the gods. His children were potential heirs or diplomatic assets. His friendships, if they could be called that, were with men who saw him not as a person, but as a divine vessel. The pharaoh was surrounded by people yet utterly alone, worshipped by millions yet known by none. The constant ceremonies were physically devastating. Religious festivals could last for days, with the pharaoh required to stand, walk, gesture, and speak according to ancient scripts that could not be altered. His feet would swell in the ceremonial sandals. His back would ache from maintaining perfect posture. His voice would grow hoarse from the ritual chanting that was required of him. Yet any sign of human frailty was seen as a crack in the divine facade that held Egyptian civilization together. If the pharaoh showed weakness, it meant the gods were displeased. If he fell ill, it suggested the cosmic order was out of balance. The very stability of the kingdom rested on the pharaoh's ability to maintain the illusion of perfection, even as his body and mind crumbled under the weight of impossible expectations. Some pharaohs broke under the pressure. Akhenaten's radical religious reforms may have been as much about escaping the suffocating demands of traditional pharaonic performance as about genuine spiritual conviction. His move to a new capital, his attempt to simplify religious practice, his embrace of a more naturalistic art style that showed him as human rather than divine, all suggest a man desperate to escape the gilded cage of godhood. But even Akhenaten's rebellion was ultimately crushed. After his death, his successors worked systematically to erase his memory, to restore the traditional forms that had kept Egypt stable for millennia. The message was clear. The pharaoh belonged not to himself, but to the eternal system that made him divine and kept him prisoner. The most tragic aspect of pharaonic life was perhaps the knowledge that it would never end. There was no retirement from godhood, no stepping down from divinity. The pharaoh would perform these exhausting rituals, maintain this impossible facade, carry this crushing burden until the day he died. And even then, his body would be transformed through mummification into an eternal vessel for his divine essence, forever frozen in the performance of perfection. The priests who controlled these rituals understood their power perfectly. They held the pharaoh's legitimacy in their hands, and they used it to maintain their own positions and privileges. If a pharaoh tried to reduce the ceremonial demands, to simplify the rituals, to assert his human needs over divine requirements, the priests could whisper that the gods were displeased, that cosmic order was threatened, that the kingdom itself was in danger. So the pharaohs danced their elaborate dance of divinity year after year, decade after decade, their bodies breaking down under the weight of their own supposed perfection. They were the most powerful men on earth, yet they were powerless to escape the golden chains that bound them to a role that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. As we drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps we can spare a thought for these ancient kings, these living gods, who were perhaps the most constrained and suffering men in their entire kingdom. They had everything that power could buy, yet they were poorer than the humblest farmer who could at least scratch when he itched, yawn when he was tired, and eat his simple bread without performing for invisible audiences. The pharaohs ruled the world, but they could never rule themselves. And in that terrible irony lies one of history's most profound lessons about the true cost of absolute power. But while the physical and psychological burdens of rulership crushed pharaohs from without, perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their existence was the constant pressure from the supernatural realm that surrounded them at every moment. For a pharaoh was not merely a king ruling over mortals, but a living bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the gods, expected to maintain cosmic balance while navigating forces that could destroy both body and soul. The pharaoh's daily existence was saturated with divine encounters that would drive ordinary mortals to madness. Each morning, they were required to perform the ritual of awakening Ra, the sun god, through elaborate ceremonies that could not be altered or abbreviated. The slightest mistake in pronunciation, gesture, or timing could theoretically cause the sun to fail to rise, plunging Egypt into eternal darkness. Imagine waking each day knowing that your performance of ancient words and movements held the fate of the entire world in balance. But the morning solar ritual was only the beginning of an endless cycle of supernatural obligations. Throughout the day, pharaohs were expected to commune with dozens of deities, each with their own specific requirements, temperaments, and potential for divine wrath. They had to interpret omens in the flight of birds, the patterns of stars, the flooding of the Nile, and even the behavior of sacred animals. A pharaoh who misread divine signs could lead their kingdom into famine, plague, or military disaster. The weight of these supernatural responsibilities became even more crushing when we consider that pharaohs were simultaneously expected to be divine themselves while remaining terrifyingly vulnerable to the whims of greater gods. They were caught in an impossible contradiction, worshipped as living gods by their subjects, while living in constant fear of divine punishment from the celestial pantheon above them. Consider the pharaoh Akhenaten, who dared to challenge the traditional pantheon by promoting the worship of Aten, the sun disk, above all other gods. His religious revolution wasn't merely a political decision, it was a supernatural gamble that put his soul, his dynasty, and his entire kingdom at risk. The traditional priesthood warned that abandoning the old gods would bring catastrophe, and indeed, Akhenaten's reign ended in chaos, his capital city abandoned, his religious reforms reversed, and his very name chiseled from monuments as if the gods themselves had demanded his erasure from history. The pharaoh's connection to the divine realm also meant they were constantly bombarded with supernatural visions, dreams, and divine visitations that ordinary mortals never experienced. These weren't gentle spiritual encounters, but overwhelming confrontations with cosmic forces that could shatter human consciousness. Pharaohs reported dreams where they stood before the throne of Ra, their flesh burning from divine radiance, or visions where Isis appeared to deliver prophecies that filled them with both divine knowledge and terrible responsibility. The psychological toll of these supernatural encounters was immense. Pharaohs developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety and paranoia, constantly watching for divine signs, interpreting every unusual event as a message from the gods, and living in terror that they had somehow offended a deity without realizing it. They surrounded themselves with armies of priests, scribes, and interpreters, all trying to help them navigate the treacherous waters of divine communication. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the pharaoh's role as judge of the dead and guardian of the afterlife. They were expected to ensure that the complex rituals of mummification and burial were performed correctly for thousands of their subjects, knowing that any error could condemn souls to eternal torment or prevent them from reaching the afterlife entirely. The weight of holding so many souls in their hands, of being responsible for the eternal fate of their people, created a psychological burden that no human mind was designed to bear. The supernatural demands placed on pharaohs also extended to their physical bodies in ways that were both sacred and horrifying. They were required to undergo ritual purifications that involved being bathed in sacred oils that could burn the skin, having their bodies painted with substances containing mercury and other toxic materials, and consuming blessed foods and drinks that often contained hallucinogenic compounds designed to facilitate divine visions. These substances might grant them supernatural experiences, but they also slowly poisoned their bodies and minds over years of continuous use. The pharaoh's crown itself was believed to be a conduit for divine power, but wearing it was a form of supernatural torture. The various crowns of Egypt were not merely ceremonial objects, but were thought to channel the raw power of the gods directly through the pharaoh's skull. Many pharaohs reported severe headaches, visions, and even temporary madness after wearing certain crowns during important ceremonies. The white crown of Upper Egypt was said to connect the pharaoh directly to the scorching power of Ra, while the red crown of Lower Egypt linked them to the chaotic energy of Set. Wearing the double crown, combining both, was described by some pharaohs as feeling like having their heads split open by divine lightning. The constant exposure to supernatural forces also manifested in physical ways that were both revered and feared. Pharaohs often developed what their subjects saw as divine marks, strange scars or discolorations that appeared on their skin after particularly intense religious ceremonies. These marks were interpreted as signs of divine favor, but they were actually evidence of the physical toll that constant supernatural exposure was taking on their bodies. Some pharaohs developed sensitivity to sunlight, ironic for those meant to embody the sun god, while others experienced seizures or episodes of temporary blindness that were seen as moments of divine possession. The pharaoh's supernatural responsibilities also extended to their role as protector against cosmic evil. They were expected to perform rituals to hold back Apep, the serpent of chaos that threatened to devour Ra each night during his journey through the underworld. These rituals required the pharaoh to symbolically battle cosmic forces of destruction, often involving ceremonies where they had to remain in complete darkness for hours, chanting spells while imagining themselves locked in combat with primordial evil. Many pharaohs emerged from these rituals physically and psychologically exhausted, some never fully recovering their mental equilibrium. The isolation created by their supernatural status was perhaps equally torturous. Pharaohs could not form normal human relationships because their divine nature meant that every interaction was filtered through religious protocol and supernatural significance. They could not touch or be touched casually, could not eat meals without complex purification rituals, and could not even sleep without priests monitoring their dreams for divine messages. They lived in a bubble of supernatural isolation that cut them off from basic human connection and comfort. Even their deaths were not their own, but belonged to the realm of the supernatural. Pharaohs knew from childhood that their deaths would involve elaborate mummification processes that would preserve their bodies for eternity while their souls underwent dangerous journeys through the underworld. They lived with the knowledge that their deaths would not bring peace, but would launch them into an afterlife filled with trials, judgment, and the possibility of eternal torment if they had failed in their divine duties. The supernatural burden of pharaonic rule created a vicious cycle where the very powers that made pharaohs godlike also drove them toward madness and physical collapse. They were expected to channel divine forces that human bodies and minds were never meant to contain, to make decisions with cosmic consequences while struggling with the psychological toll of constant supernatural pressure. As we continue our exploration of why pharaonic rule was a nightmare, we see how the divine nature of their position created not elevation, but entrapment, not glory, but a form of spiritual and psychological torture that lasted from the moment of their coronation until their mummified bodies were sealed away in tombs that were themselves supernatural prisons, designed to hold both their earthly remains and their tormented souls for all eternity. The weight of divinity pressed down like the desert sun at midday, relentless and inescapable. By now, you understand that being Pharaoh wasn't the golden dream we imagine today. We've explored the crushing religious obligations, the political machinations, the genetic nightmares of royal inbreeding, and the supernatural terrors that haunted every royal decision. But tonight, we delve deeper into perhaps the most insidious torture of all, the complete erosion of human identity beneath the mask of godhood. Picture this, if you will. You are Pharaoh, divine ruler of the greatest civilization on earth. You wake each morning not in your own bed, but in a sacred chamber where every breath you take is monitored by priests. Your feet cannot touch the ground without ceremony. Your food cannot pass your lips without blessing. Your words cannot be spoken without scribes recording them for eternity. You are not a person anymore. You are a living hieroglyph, a breathing statue, a god trapped in human flesh. The most devastating aspect wasn't the physical constraints we've discussed, though those were crushing enough. It was the systematic destruction of the self. From the moment a future pharaoh drew their first breath, their humanity was slowly, methodically stripped away, layer by layer, until nothing remained but the role they were born to play. Consider the young prince Amenhotep, later to become one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. At age 5, he was removed from his mother's care, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. A future god could not be raised like a mortal child. He was placed in the care of the highest priests, men who had dedicated their lives to serving the divine. These priests loved him, certainly, but they loved the god he would become, not the boy he was. Every lesson was a ritual. Learning to read hieroglyphs wasn't simply education, it was communion with the sacred words of Thoth. Learning to walk properly wasn't etiquette, it was embodying the measured pace of Ra across the heavens. The child's natural curiosity, his desire to run and play and laugh too loudly, was gently but firmly corrected. Gods do not run. Gods do not play. Gods certainly do not laugh too loudly. By age 10, young Amenhotep had learned to speak in the third person. Not, I want water, but the living Horus requires refreshment. Not, I'm tired, but the son of Ra seeks rest. It wasn't pretension, it was survival. The boy was learning to disappear so the god could emerge. And with each passing year, less and less of the original child remained. The truly horrifying part was how natural this transformation became. The priests weren't monsters. They were devout believers creating what they saw as the perfect vessel for divine will. The child pharaoh learned to find comfort in ritual because ritual was all he knew. He learned to find identity in titles because his personal identity had been carefully erased. He learned to find love in worship because genuine human affection had been replaced with religious devotion. When Amenhotep finally took the throne as a young man, he was magnificent to behold. Every gesture perfect, every word measured, every decision filtered through millennia of tradition and protocol. He was the living embodiment of divine kingship, the perfect Pharaoh. He was also, in every way that mattered, completely hollow. This hollowing out wasn't unique to Amenhotep. It was the systematic fate of every pharaoh. The great Ramesses II, whom we remember as Ramesses the Great, was by all accounts a remarkable ruler. He built monuments that still inspire awe, led armies to victory, and ruled for over 60 years. But what was the cost of that greatness? Contemporary records show a man who could not eat a meal without 30 different ritual preparations, who could not speak to his own children without priests present to ensure proper protocol, who had not been truly alone with another human being since childhood. Imagine the psychological toll. You are surrounded constantly by people, yet utterly alone. Thousands worship you, yet none truly know you. You have ultimate power over the kingdom, yet no control over your own daily existence. You are revered as a god, yet forbidden from experiencing the simple joys that make life worth living. You cannot weep in private, for your tears are sacred and must be witnessed. You cannot express doubt, for gods do not doubt. You cannot even die naturally, for your death must be as scripted and ceremonial as your life. The royal women faced their own unique torments. Queen Nefertiti, despite her legendary beauty and apparent influence, was never allowed to be simply a woman. Every aspect of her appearance was dictated by religious requirements. Her iconic crown wasn't a fashion choice, it was a religious necessity, representing her role as the earthly embodiment of various goddesses. Her makeup wasn't vanity, it was ritual preparation to properly channel divine energy. Even her famous beauty was a burden, for it meant she could never appear in public without perfect cosmetic preparation, could never be seen in any state that might diminish the divine illusion. The children of pharaohs perhaps suffered most of all. Born into this system, they never had a chance to know what normal human relationships felt like. Prince Thutmose, eldest son of Amenhotep III, was raised from birth to be the perfect heir. Every moment of his education was designed to prepare him for godhood. He excelled at his studies, mastered the rituals, learned to embody divine authority. And then, at age 16, he died suddenly of illness. The tragedy wasn't just his early death, though that was devastating enough. The tragedy was that in his brief life, he had never been allowed to simply be a teenager. He had never experienced the joy of friendship unencumbered by rank, never known the simple pleasure of a spontaneous laugh, never felt the comfort of being loved for who he was, rather than what he represented. He died having lived his entire life as a symbol, never as a person. This systematic dehumanization created pharaohs who were simultaneously the most powerful people on earth and the most powerless. They could command armies, but couldn't choose their own breakfast. They could decree laws, but couldn't decide when to sleep. They could order the construction of monuments that would last forever, but couldn't spend an hour alone with their own thoughts. The court records from various dynasties reveal the profound loneliness that resulted. Pharaoh Akhenaten's radical religious reforms, which nearly destroyed the kingdom, can be read as the desperate attempt of a deeply isolated man to create a form of worship that might allow for genuine personal connection with the divine. His famous hymn to the Aten contains passages of startling emotional vulnerability, the cry of a human soul trapped within a divine prison. Some pharaohs tried to rebel in small ways. Tutankhamun, that boy king whose tomb captured our modern imagination, appears to have made tiny acts of personal assertion. He kept a collection of ordinary objects in his personal chambers, simple things that belonged to no ritual, served no divine purpose. A child's toy, a piece of common pottery, a worn leather sandal. These pathetic treasures suggest a young man desperately trying to hold on to some fragment of normal human experience. But even these small rebellions came with enormous risks. The priests, the courtiers, the entire machinery of the state existed to maintain the divine illusion. Any crack in the facade threatened not just the pharaoh's authority, but the cosmic order itself. A pharaoh who acted too human endangered the kingdom's relationship with the gods, risked the annual flood, threatened the very survival of Egypt. The most heartbreaking aspect was how thoroughly the pharaohs themselves internalized this system. They weren't just victims of it, they became its most dedicated enforcers. Having known no other way of being, they genuinely believed that their humanity was a sacrifice required for the greater good. They convinced themselves that their personal suffering was noble, that their isolation was sacred, that their emptiness was fullness. Queen Hatshepsut, one of the few women to successfully claim the throne, had to literally transform herself into a male pharaoh to rule. She wore the false beard, adopted masculine titles, even had herself depicted with a male body in official art. But this wasn't just political necessity, it was the complete erasure of her identity as a woman. She ruled brilliantly for over 20 years, but at the cost of entirely abandoning who she had been born to be. The ancient Egyptian texts speak of pharaohs as living gods, but they might more accurately be described as dying humans. For with each passing year on the throne, more of their humanity withered away, replaced by divine protocol and sacred obligation. They became hollow vessels, magnificent to behold, but empty within, filled only with the weight of divine expectation and the echo of their own forgotten selves. And when death finally came, it brought no relief. Even in the tomb, surrounded by treasures and protected by spells, the pharaoh's mummy was positioned to continue serving divine purposes. The afterlife for a pharaoh wasn't rest, it was eternal duty, an endless continuation of the same sacred obligations that had consumed their earthly existence. Even death couldn't free them from the prison of godhood. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your own simple bed, free to dream your own dreams and wake when you choose, remember those golden kings and queens of ancient Egypt. Remember that their crown was a cage, their palace a prison, and their divinity a slow, inexorable death of everything that made them human. They gained the worship of millions but lost themselves entirely, becoming perfect gods at the cost of ever being imperfect, beautiful, gloriously flawed human beings. The sands of time have covered their kingdoms, but their tragedy echoes still, a warning whispered across the centuries about the price of power and the weight of being more than human in a world that demands nothing less than divine perfection. Part 8. The Pharaoh's Divine Burden. But perhaps the most crushing aspect of being a pharaoh was not the physical deterioration or the social isolation, but the supernatural weight that pressed down upon them like the massive stone blocks of their own pyramids. For you see, a pharaoh was not merely a ruler. They were the living bridge between the mortal world and the realm of the gods, and that bridge bore traffic in both directions, most of it unwelcome. The divine connection that elevated pharaohs above ordinary mortals also made them vessels for forces beyond human comprehension. They experienced visions that would drive lesser minds to madness, dreams populated by gods who spoke in riddles and demanded impossible things. The goddess Isis might appear in the depths of night, her voice like the rushing of the Nile, commanding the pharaoh to build a temple in her honor using stones that didn't exist. The god Set could manifest as a shadow that followed the pharaoh through palace corridors, whispering of chaos and destruction, reminding them that order was always temporary, always under threat. These supernatural encounters weren't metaphorical or symbolic. They were viscerally real experiences that left pharaohs trembling and exhausted. Imagine trying to rule a kingdom while constantly battling entities that existed beyond the physical realm, beings whose very presence could overwhelm human consciousness. The pharaoh's mind became a battlefield where cosmic forces waged their eternal struggles, using the royal psyche as their arena. The responsibility for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order that kept the universe from sliding into chaos, rested entirely on the pharaoh's shoulders. Every decision they made, every word they spoke, every gesture they performed had to align perfectly with divine will. A single mistake, a moment of weakness, a failure to properly interpret the god's demands could unleash catastrophe upon Egypt. The Nile might refuse to flood, plunging the land into famine. Plagues could descend like clouds of locusts. Neighboring kingdoms might suddenly find the courage to invade, sensing that Egypt's divine protection had wavered. The pharaoh lived with the constant knowledge that they were simultaneously the most powerful person in their world and utterly powerless against the cosmic forces that flowed through them. They could command armies, build monuments that would outlast civilizations, and decide the fate of millions. Yet they remained at the mercy of dreams and visions that could strike without warning, leaving them gasping and disoriented in the pre-dawn darkness. Consider Akhenaten, who dared to revolutionize Egypt's entire religious system based on his supernatural experiences with the god Aten. The visions he claimed to receive drove him to abandon the traditional pantheon, move the capital to a barren desert site, and completely restructure Egyptian society. Whether his divine encounters were genuine mystical experiences or the product of a mind cracking under supernatural pressure, the result was the same: chaos, rebellion, and the eventual collapse of everything he had built. The pharaoh's supernatural burden extended beyond personal visions to encompass their role as cosmic guardian. They were expected to battle the forces of chaos not just through political and military means, but through ritual combat in spiritual dimensions. Ancient texts describe pharaohs engaging in nightly battles against Apep, the serpent of chaos, fighting to ensure that the sun would rise each morning. These weren't symbolic struggles. They were exhausting spiritual conflicts that left the pharaoh drained and vulnerable. The weight of prophecy added another layer to their supernatural torment. Pharaohs were constantly receiving omens, dreams, and prophetic warnings that demanded interpretation and action. A flock of birds flying in an unusual pattern might herald invasion. A priest's dream could indicate that the gods were displeased with recent temple offerings. The pharaoh had to navigate these supernatural communications while maintaining the facade of divine certainty, never admitting doubt or confusion even when the messages seemed contradictory or impossible to fulfill. The isolation of divine kingship meant that pharaohs couldn't share these supernatural burdens with anyone. No advisor could truly understand what it meant to feel the weight of cosmic responsibility pressing down on their consciousness. No priest could comprehend the terror of receiving a direct divine command that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about proper governance. The pharaoh stood alone at the intersection of human and divine realms, bearing witness to truths too vast and terrible for mortal minds to fully grasp. Even their deaths were not their own. Pharaohs faced the knowledge that their passing would trigger massive supernatural upheavals, that their journey to the afterlife would determine Egypt's fate for generations. The elaborate burial preparations weren't just about ensuring their comfort in the next world. They were cosmic engineering projects designed to prevent the pharaoh's death from tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself. And so they ruled, these god kings of Egypt, carrying burdens that would have crushed ordinary mortals, maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos, while their own minds and bodies slowly crumbled under pressures no human was designed to bear. They were simultaneously the most exalted and most cursed individuals in their civilization, living gods trapped in mortal flesh, divine bridges spanning an impossible gulf between heaven and earth. In the end, the pharaoh's divine connection, which was supposed to be their greatest source of power, became their most crushing burden. They were prisoners of their own divinity, trapped in a role that demanded everything while offering only the cold comfort of being remembered, if they were fortunate, as monuments to the terrible price of godhood in human form. If the physical suffering wasn't enough, if the endless rituals and political maneuvering hadn't already broken them, there remained one final cruelty that defined the pharaoh's existence, the complete and utter isolation that came with being considered divine. For you see, when you are proclaimed a living God, when every person who approaches you must prostrate themselves and speak only when spoken to, when your very presence is believed to carry the power of life and death, you discover something terrible about divinity. It is profoundly, devastatingly lonely. The pharaoh lived surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Courtiers filled the palace halls, servants attended to every need, priests performed elaborate ceremonies in their honor, but none of these people could truly see them. They saw only the crown, the regalia, the divine mask that had been placed over the human face beneath. The pharaoh could never simply be a person having a conversation, never express doubt or fear or simple human confusion without it being interpreted as divine will or, worse, as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Consider the profound psychological weight of this isolation. Every word the pharaoh spoke was analyzed, recorded, interpreted as prophecy or command. They could never ask a simple question without it being seen as a test of the listener's knowledge. They could never express uncertainty without causing panic among their advisors. They could never show affection or preference without it being seen as a political statement that could shift the balance of power throughout the kingdom. Even their closest relationships were poisoned by this divine status. A pharaoh's spouse might love them, but they also had to worship them. Their children were raised to see them not primarily as a parent, but as a god who happened to share their bloodline. The pharaoh's siblings and relatives lived in constant awareness that their kinship to divinity could elevate them or destroy them depending on the pharaoh's favor. There was no relationship, no matter how intimate, that wasn't fundamentally altered by the impossible burden of godhood. The pharaoh's emotional life became a carefully guarded secret, hidden behind layers of ritual and ceremony. They learned early that genuine emotional expression was dangerous, that showing too much joy or sorrow could be interpreted as divine approval or displeasure of whatever had caused those feelings. They developed elaborate internal defenses, learning to feel their emotions privately while presenting only the serene, unchanging face expected of divinity. This emotional suppression created its own form of madness. The pharaoh lived with the constant awareness that their inner life, their true thoughts and feelings, were essentially irrelevant to their role. They were expected to be a perfect vessel for divine will, but that meant their human personality, their individual desires and fears, had to be continuously sacrificed on the altar of their supposed godhood. The isolation was made worse by the fact that the pharaoh could never escape their role. Modern celebrities can retreat to private homes, remove their makeup, spend time with family and friends who knew them before fame. But a pharaoh was born into divinity or married into it, and there was no private self to retreat to. They were pharaoh when they woke, pharaoh when they ate, pharaoh when they tried to sleep. The crown might be removed, but the divine burden never was. This constant performance of divinity took an enormous psychological toll. Many pharaohs developed what we might now recognize as dissociative symptoms, a sense of detachment from their own lives and experiences. They watched themselves perform the role of God King, while feeling increasingly disconnected from the person beneath the performance. Some described feeling like they were watching their lives from outside their bodies, as if the pharaoh who performed the rituals and made the royal pronouncements was a different person entirely from the confused, lonely human being trapped inside. The pharaoh's relationship with their own mortality became deeply complex and troubled. On one hand, they were told they were divine, eternal, connected to the imperishable gods. On the other hand, they lived in a human body that aged, sickened, and would eventually die. This contradiction created a unique form of existential terror. They were simultaneously immortal and mortal, divine and human, all-powerful and utterly helpless. Many pharaohs became obsessed with death and the afterlife not out of spiritual devotion, but out of desperate hope that death might finally free them from the burden of divinity. They poured enormous resources into their tombs and burial preparations, but this wasn't just about ensuring a comfortable afterlife. It was about the possibility that in death they might finally be allowed to simply be human, to rest from the exhausting performance of godhood. The pharaoh's daily routine was structured to minimize any possibility of genuine human connection. They were surrounded by protocol, ritual, and ceremony that kept everyone at a safe distance. Even their meals were elaborate religious ceremonies, with specific prayers, offerings, and rituals that transformed the simple human act of eating into another divine performance. They couldn't even satisfy basic human needs without it becoming a theological statement. Sleep, ironically, became both refuge and torment for these divine rulers. It was the only time when they might escape the constant awareness of their role, but their dreams were often haunted by the weight of their responsibilities and the fear that they were failing in their divine duties. Many pharaohs reported recurring nightmares about the gods withdrawing their favor, about Egypt falling into chaos because of their inadequacy as divine intermediaries. The pharaoh's isolation was also intellectual and creative. They were expected to embody divine wisdom, which meant they could never admit ignorance or ask for instruction without undermining their supposed omniscience. They couldn't explore new ideas or question established traditions without it being seen as divine revelation that might disrupt the entire social order. Their minds, no matter how curious or creative, had to be constantly disciplined to serve the narrow requirements of their divine role. Perhaps most tragically, this isolation often prevented pharaohs from developing genuine relationships with their own children. The royal heirs were raised from birth to see their parent not as a father or mother, but as a god who would someday pass divine authority to them. The normal bonds of family affection were complicated by the knowledge that the child was also a potential successor who might need to be evaluated, tested, or even eliminated if they proved unsuitable for divine rule. This systemic isolation created generations of rulers who were psychologically damaged by their supposed divine status. They learned to mistrust their own emotions, to doubt their own perceptions, to see their human needs and desires as weaknesses that had to be overcome. They became experts at performing divinity while losing touch with their own humanity. The pharaoh's isolation was enforced not just by protocol, but by the genuine fear others felt in their presence. Even close advisors and family members internalized the belief that the pharaoh was divine, which created an emotional distance that couldn't be bridged by affection or familiarity. People who loved the pharaoh as a person still had to relate to them primarily as a god, which meant that even the most intimate relationships were fundamentally asymmetrical and artificial. As we've seen throughout this exploration, being a pharaoh in ancient Egypt was indeed a profound paradox of power and suffering. These rulers wielded enormous authority over one of history's greatest civilizations, but they paid for that power with their physical health, their mental stability, their emotional well-being, and ultimately their humanity. They were worshipped as gods, but lived as prisoners of their own divine status, isolated from genuine human connection by the very role that was supposed to elevate them above ordinary mortals. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt remind us that absolute power, even power justified by religious belief and social tradition, comes with costs that extend far beyond the obvious burdens of leadership. They show us how the deification of human beings can become a form of psychological torture, trapping individuals in roles that deny their basic humanity while demanding impossible perfection in service of social stability and religious order. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for these long-dead god-kings who bore such impossible burdens. Their golden masks and elaborate tombs have survived millennia, but the human beings beneath those symbols of divinity lived lives of quiet desperation, forever isolated by the very power that history remembers them for. They ruled an empire, commanded armies, and built monuments that still inspire awe today, but they paid for their divine status with the most basic human need of all, the simple comfort of being known, understood, and accepted for who they truly were beneath the crown. Before we bring our exploration of medieval pharaohs to a close, let's drift one final time into the shadowed chambers of divine kingship, where the weight of godhood itself became the heaviest burden of all. Tonight, we complete our journey through the gilded prison that was pharaonic life, where even death offered no true escape from the crushing responsibilities of being a living god. The pharaoh's final years were perhaps the most tormented of all. As their bodies inevitably began to fail, as age crept across features that were supposed to remain eternally youthful and divine, the very foundation of their godhood came under quiet scrutiny. How could a living god grow old? How could divine flesh weaken and wither like that of common mortals? The royal physicians worked frantically to maintain the illusion. Elaborate cosmetics masked the signs of aging. Heavy ceremonial garments concealed the trembling hands and stooped shoulders that came with decades of performing endless rituals. But beneath the painted face and golden regalia, the pharaoh was slowly crumbling under the weight of their own divinity. Consider the psychological torment of knowing that your death would trigger a massive crisis of faith. The pharaoh wasn't just a person facing mortality. They were a god whose demise would shake the very foundations of cosmic order. The pressure to remain strong, to project divine authority, even while battling illness or injury, was almost unbearable. They couldn't show weakness, couldn't admit pain, couldn't even express normal human fears about death without undermining the entire religious and political system that depended on their divinity. The isolation deepened as death approached. Fewer and fewer people were allowed into the pharaoh's presence, partly to maintain the illusion of divine health, but also because the very sight of a dying god was considered spiritually dangerous. The pharaoh spent their final days surrounded by physicians, priests, and embalmers, people who saw them not as a person, but as a divine vessel that needed to be preserved for eternity. Even the process of dying was ritualized beyond recognition. The pharaoh couldn't simply pass away peacefully like a normal human being. Their death had to be carefully managed, their final breath timed with astronomical events, their last words recorded for posterity. They died not as individuals, but as cosmic events, their personal suffering subsumed into the larger mythology of divine transition. And then came the ultimate irony. The elaborate mummification process that we often think of as a privilege was actually a final violation of their humanity. Their body was cut open, their organs removed, their flesh treated with chemicals and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. The pharaoh's mortal remains were transformed into a sacred object, but in the process, any trace of the person they had once been was erased forever. The mummified pharaoh became the ultimate symbol of their tragic existence. Perfectly preserved, but utterly lifeless, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, but incapable of enjoying it, worshipped for eternity but forever silent. Their tomb, that magnificent monument to their power, was really just an elaborate prison where their preserved body would lie alone in the darkness for thousands of years. But perhaps most tragically of all, the pharaoh's death solved nothing. The cycle simply began again with their successor, who would inherit not just the crown, but all the impossible burdens that came with it. The new pharaoh would face the same isolation, the same supernatural responsibilities, the same crushing weight of divine expectations. The system that had destroyed their predecessor would now begin its slow work on them. The royal children, who might have hoped for some relief after witnessing their parents' suffering, instead found themselves thrust into an even more intense version of the same nightmare. They had grown up seeing the cost of divine kingship, but now they had to live it themselves, knowing full well what awaited them. As we reflect on these ancient rulers from our comfortable modern perspective, it's easy to focus on their immense power and wealth. But the deeper truth is that the pharaohs were perhaps history's most tragic figures. People who had everything except the one thing that matters most: the freedom to be human. They ruled vast empires but couldn't rule their own lives. They commanded millions but couldn't command a moment's genuine peace. They were worshipped as gods, but were denied the simple human connections that give life meaning. They possessed unimaginable wealth, but were spiritually and emotionally bankrupt. The pharaohs' monuments still stand today as testaments to their power, but they also serve as reminders of the price that power demanded. Every pyramid, every temple, every golden mask represents not just royal glory, but human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. In the end, the pharaohs' greatest tragedy wasn't that they died, it's that they never truly lived. They existed in a liminal space between human and divine, belonging fully to neither world, trapped forever in a role that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. So, as we close this exploration of why it sucked to be a pharaoh in ancient times, let us remember these ancient rulers, not just as powerful kings, but as cautionary tales about the dangers of absolute power and divine pretension. Their gilded lives were really gilded cages, their divine status a divine curse, their eternal monuments really memorials to the human cost of trying to be more than human. The next time you see an image of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh in all their golden glory, remember the person behind the mask, isolated, burdened, trapped in a role that offered everything except happiness. They were living gods who paid the ultimate price for their divinity, their humanity itself. And with that sobering thought, we bring our journey through the nightmarish reality of pharaonic life to a close. Sleep well, knowing that whatever burdens you carry, they pale in comparison to the weight of a golden crown that was really a golden chain, binding its wearer to a fate worse than death. A life without life. A throne built on the bones of human joy. As the pharaoh's body began to fail in those final agonizing years, the machinery of death preparation would begin its slow, methodical turning. The same priests who had tormented him with endless rituals throughout his life now turned their attention to his impending mortality. But even here, even in death, there would be no escape from the suffocating weight of divine expectation. The process of mummification that awaited him was not merely a preservation of his physical form, but another elaborate performance in which his corpse would be the unwilling star. The irony was crushing in its completeness. Throughout his entire existence, the pharaoh had been told that his body was sacred, that it housed the living essence of Horus, that every breath he took was a divine act. Yet now, as that sacred vessel began to deteriorate, as his joints swelled with arthritis from decades of ceremonial posturing, as his teeth rotted from a diet heavy in honey and dates, as his spine curved under the weight of massive ceremonial headdresses, the very priests who had proclaimed his physical form divine began preparing for its systematic destruction and reconstruction. The mummification process itself was a grotesque parody of the care his body should have received in life. The embalmers would remove his brain through his nose with long metal hooks, discarding it as worthless refuse. His internal organs would be carved from his body, sorted like cuts of meat, and placed in canopic jars to be guarded by minor deities. His body cavity would be stuffed with natron salt and left to desiccate for 70 days, transforming his once sacred flesh into something resembling leather. Even in death, the pharaoh could not escape the performance. His mummified form would be wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, each layer applied with specific prayers and rituals. Amulets would be placed between the wrappings at precisely determined locations, turning his corpse into a religious artifact before it was even cold. His face would be covered with a death mask of gold, erasing his actual features and replacing them with an idealized version of divine perfection that bore no resemblance to the worn, exhausted man who had actually lived and suffered. The funeral procession would be another spectacular display of wealth and power, with thousands of mourners whose grief was as choreographed as every other aspect of the pharaoh's existence. Professional mourners would wail and tear their clothes in displays of sorrow that were more theatrical than genuine, while priests chanted the same formulaic prayers that had followed the pharaoh through every major transition of his life. Even his journey to the afterlife would be a public spectacle, his private pain transformed into entertainment for the masses. The tomb itself represented the ultimate irony of the pharaoh's existence. These massive monuments, built by thousands of laborers over decades, were designed to ensure his eternal comfort and power in the afterlife. Yet they were also elaborate prisons, sealed chambers where his mummified form would lie in darkness for millennia, surrounded by treasures he could never again enjoy, and protected by curses that would claim the lives of anyone who dared disturb his rest. The walls of his tomb would be covered with scenes of his supposed triumphs and divine nature, creating a permanent record of the lies that had defined his existence. Images of him making offerings to the gods, receiving their blessings, and ruling with wisdom and justice would be carved into stone, creating an eternal propaganda campaign that would outlast empires. The reality of his suffering, his loneliness, his human frailty would be carefully edited out of this final narrative, leaving only the myth of divine perfection. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the pharaoh's death was how it highlighted the ultimate futility of his lifelong sacrifice. Despite all his ritual observances, despite his perfect adherence to divine protocol, despite his willing submission to the crushing weight of cosmic responsibility, Egypt would continue to face the same challenges that had plagued it during his reign. The Nile would still flood irregularly, crops would still fail, enemies would still threaten the borders, and the people would still suffer from disease and poverty. The new pharaoh, likely his son, would inherit not only the throne, but also the same impossible burden of divine expectation. The cycle would begin anew, with another human being sacrificed to the insatiable demands of divine kingship. The dead pharaoh's suffering would be forgotten, his human struggles erased from memory, leaving only the golden mask of divine perfection to inspire and terrify the next generation. In the deepest chambers of his tomb, surrounded by the treasures that had once symbolized his power, the pharaoh's mummified remains would begin the slow process of decay, despite all efforts at preservation. The linen wrappings would gradually deteriorate, the carefully applied resins would crack and crumble, and the flesh beneath would turn to dust. Even his physical form, so carefully preserved through the elaborate mummification process, would eventually succumb to the same natural processes that claimed every other human being. The gods he had served so faithfully would offer no special protection for his remains. Tomb robbers would eventually break through the sealed entrances, strip away the treasures, and scatter his bones across the burial chamber floor. The curses that were supposed to protect him would prove powerless against human greed and desperation. his carefully preserved body, would become a curiosity for archaeologists. Studied and photographed and displayed in museums, his privacy violated in ways that would have horrified him in life. The religious system that had demanded such sacrifice from its pharaohs would eventually crumble, replaced by new beliefs and new gods. The temples would fall into ruin, the priests would disappear into history, and the elaborate rituals that had consumed the pharaoh's life would be forgotten. The cosmic order he had worked so desperately to maintain would be revealed as nothing more than human construction, a complex system of control that had demanded everything from its practitioners while offering nothing in return. Yet even in this ultimate futility, there was something profoundly human about the pharaoh's struggle, his willingness to sacrifice his personal happiness for what he believed was the greater good, his dedication to duty despite the enormous personal cost, his endurance of suffering for the sake of his people. These qualities transcended the specific context of ancient Egypt and spoke to something fundamental about the human condition. The pharaoh's tragedy was not just that he was born into an impossible situation, but that he was human enough to feel the weight of that impossibility. A true God would not have suffered as he did, would not have felt the loneliness and despair that marked his daily existence. His suffering was proof of his humanity, evidence that beneath the golden mask and divine titles lived a man who longed for connection, understanding, and simple human happiness. The elaborate mythology that surrounded the pharaoh's divine nature was, in many ways, a collective attempt to deny this fundamental humanity. By transforming him into a god, Egyptian society could avoid confronting the ethical implications of what they were doing to a fellow human being. They could rationalize the sacrifice by claiming it was not really sacrifice at all, that the pharaoh was somehow above human concerns and immune to human suffering. This denial extended to the pharaoh himself, who was taught from birth to suppress his natural human responses and embrace his divine role. The psychological damage caused by this constant suppression of his authentic self was immense, creating a kind of spiritual fragmentation that made genuine happiness impossible. He was forced to live as a stranger to himself, constantly performing a role that felt fundamentally false while denying the validity of his own human emotions and desires. The court physicians who treated the pharaoh's physical ailments were powerless against this deeper spiritual sickness. They could provide remedies for his headaches and joint pain, but they could not cure the existential despair that came from living a life that was fundamentally untrue to his nature. The pharaoh's body bore the visible marks of his suffering, but his soul carried wounds that were far deeper and more painful. The education system that prepared future pharaohs for their divine role was, in essence, a sophisticated form of psychological conditioning designed to break down their natural human responses and replace them with artificial divine ones. Children who should have been playing and learning about the world were instead subjected to rigorous training in ritual performance and divine protocol. Their natural curiosity and creativity were channeled into narrow religious channels, their emotional development stunted by the constant emphasis on divine perfection. The result was a generation of rulers who were technically competent in their divine duties, but emotionally and psychologically damaged by their training. They knew how to perform the rituals perfectly, how to maintain the proper divine demeanor, and how to project the image of godlike authority, but they had never learned how to be fully human. This fundamental disconnect between their public role and their private self created a kind of permanent internal conflict that made genuine contentment impossible. The pharaoh's relationships with his family members were inevitably distorted by this same dynamic. His children could never simply be his children. They were potential heirs to the divine throne, or valuable political assets to be married off to secure alliances. His wives could never be true partners. They were instruments of policy and producers of legitimate heirs. His siblings were potential rivals or threats to his authority. Every family interaction was filtered through the lens of divine politics, making authentic emotional connection nearly impossible. The servants and courtiers who surrounded the pharaoh were equally trapped in this web of artificial relationships. They could never express genuine affection or concern for him as a person, only the ritualized reverence appropriate to his divine status. Even their attempts to care for his physical and emotional needs were constrained by the elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of his existence. They might have genuinely cared about his well-being, but they were forced to express that care through the cold formality of divine service. The pharaoh's isolation was made even more complete by the fact that he could never fully trust anyone around him. In a court where power struggles were constant and succession was always uncertain, every courtier was a potential threat, every advisor a possible conspirator. The pharaoh had to constantly guard against betrayal while maintaining the appearance of divine confidence and authority. This psychological pressure created a state of permanent paranoia that made relaxation or genuine intimacy impossible. The weight of historical responsibility also pressed down on the pharaoh with crushing force. He was not just ruling for his own generation, but for all the generations that would follow. Every decision he made would be judged by history. Every failure would be seen as a betrayal of his divine mandate. The knowledge that his reign would be measured against the great pharaohs of the past created an additional layer of pressure that made every day a test of his worthiness. The pharaoh's attempts to find meaning and purpose in his suffering were constantly undermined by the arbitrary nature of many of his duties. While some of his responsibilities, such as ensuring the prosperity of his people and defending Egypt from enemies, had genuine importance, many of his ritual obligations seemed to serve no purpose beyond maintaining the existing power structure. The hours spent in meaningless ceremonies, the energy wasted on elaborate but pointless protocols, the attention devoted to minor religious technicalities, all of this created a sense of futility that gnawed at his soul. The economic burden of maintaining the pharaoh's divine lifestyle was enormous, requiring the labor of thousands of workers and the resources of the entire kingdom. The knowledge that his comfort and ceremonial splendor came at the expense of his people's welfare created another source of psychological conflict. He was supposed to be the protector and provider for his subjects, yet his very existence consumed resources that could have been used to improve their lives. The pharaoh's death, when it finally came, was often met with a mixture of genuine grief and relief. The people mourned the loss of their divine protector, but they also looked forward to the possibility that his successor might be more effective or more fortunate. The court officials grieved for a man they had served faithfully, but they also began positioning themselves for advantage in the new reign. Even in death, the pharaoh's human suffering was overshadowed by the political and religious implications of his passing. The mummification process, despite its elaborate nature, could not preserve the pharaoh's memories, his personality, or his accumulated wisdom. All of the knowledge he had gained through his suffering, all of the insights he had developed through his struggles, all of the hard-won understanding of human nature and political reality, all of this died with him. His physical form might be preserved for millennia, but his consciousness, his true self, vanished as completely as that of any common person. The treasures buried with the pharaoh in his tomb were intended to ensure his comfort in the afterlife, but they also represented the ultimate waste of his reign. The gold and jewels that surrounded his mummy could have fed thousands of people. The artistic treasures could have beautified public spaces for the enjoyment of all. The resources devoted to his burial could have been used to build hospitals, schools, or infrastructure that would have benefited generations of Egyptians. So as we reach the end of this dark journey through the corridors of pharaonic power, we are left with a profound sense of the tragic waste of human potential that the system of divine kingship represented. These were not gods who ruled ancient Egypt, but human beings who were forced to sacrifice their humanity on the altar of political necessity. Their suffering was real, their isolation was complete, and their sacrifice was largely meaningless. The golden treasures that fill our museums, the magnificent temples that still dot the Egyptian landscape, the elaborate tombs that continue to fascinate archaeologists, all of these monuments to pharaonic power were built on a foundation of human suffering. Behind every triumph of Egyptian civilization lay the broken dreams and crushed spirits of the men who were forced to play the role of living gods. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was that this suffering was unnecessary. The pharaohs could have been effective rulers without being worshipped as gods. Egypt could have prospered without demanding the complete sacrifice of its leaders' humanity. And the civilization could have achieved greatness without destroying the souls of those who guided it. The choice to create this system of divine kingship was a human choice, and it was a choice that prioritized political control over human dignity. As you drift off to sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, remember that you have something the pharaohs never had: the freedom to be simply and authentically human. You can form genuine relationships, pursue your own interests, make your own mistakes, and find your own meaning in life. You are not trapped by the weight of divine expectation or crushed by the burden of cosmic responsibility. In your ordinary humanity, you possess a treasure that all the gold of Egypt could never buy. As we reach the end of our journey through the golden corridors of ancient Egypt's most cursed existence, it becomes painfully clear that the pharaohs were perhaps history's most elaborate prisoners. Their gilded cages were built not from iron bars, but from divine expectations, ritual obligations, and the crushing weight of a civilization's survival resting upon their shoulders. The irony is almost too profound to comprehend. These individuals, worshipped as living gods, possessed less freedom than the humblest farmer tending crops along the Nile. While a simple peasant could laugh freely, cry without shame, or speak his mind to a friend, the pharaoh's every emotion was choreographed, every word calculated, every gesture measured against cosmic significance. The farmer could fail at his harvest and try again next season. The pharaoh's failure meant chaos, famine, and the collapse of the natural order itself. Consider the psychological torture of never knowing genuine human connection. Every person who approached the pharaoh wanted something, feared something, or performed some elaborate ritual of subservience. There were no casual conversations, no spontaneous moments of joy, no authentic relationships. Even their spouses were often selected for political alliances rather than love, and their children were raised to be future vessels of divinity rather than simply beloved sons and daughters. The physical deterioration we discussed, those hidden ailments masked by cosmetics and ceremony, tells a story of bodies breaking under impossible pressure. Pharaohs suffered from stress-related illnesses, digestive problems from rich foods and irregular eating schedules, joint pain from heavy ceremonial regalia, and chronic fatigue from dawn to dusk rituals. Their physicians were skilled, but even the best medicine couldn't cure the fundamental poison of their existence, the slow death by 1,000 divine cuts. The supernatural burden perhaps weighed heaviest of all. Imagine living every day believing that your thoughts, dreams, and actions directly influenced whether the sun would rise, whether the Nile would flood, whether your people would prosper or perish. Modern psychology recognizes this as an impossible cognitive load that would drive anyone toward paranoia, anxiety, and obsessive behaviors. The pharaohs developed elaborate superstitions, performed increasingly complex rituals, and surrounded themselves with priests and magicians, trying to manage forces they believed could destroy everything at any moment. Their childhood theft represents one of history's most systematic forms of psychological abuse. These children were stripped of play, spontaneity, and normal development, instead molded into perfect divine vessels. They learned to suppress natural emotions, to perform rather than feel, to calculate rather than simply exist. By the time they reached adulthood, their authentic selves had been so thoroughly buried under layers of divine performance that they likely couldn't remember who they might have been without the crown. The political machinations surrounding them created a world where trust was impossible and paranoia was survival. Advisors plotted, priests schemed, military commanders positioned themselves for advantage, and foreign powers constantly tested Egyptian strength. The pharaoh stood at the center of this web, unable to truly trust anyone, forced to make decisions that would affect millions while never being certain of anyone's true motives or loyalty. Even their deaths offered no release, only a different kind of imprisonment. The mummification process, while preserving their bodies for eternity, also symbolized how they had been preserved in life, wrapped in layers of ritual and expectation until their humanity was completely obscured. Their tombs, magnificent as they were, became their final cages, elaborate monuments to lives that had been performances rather than authentic existence. The wealth and power that modern people might envy were meaningless when weighed against the complete absence of personal freedom, authentic relationships, and genuine self-expression. What good are golden palaces when you're too isolated to enjoy them? What value do vast armies hold when you're too paranoid to trust your generals? How empty must absolute power feel when it comes at the cost of your very identity? This brings us to a profound realization about our own lives. The freedoms we take for granted, the ability to choose our own paths, to form genuine relationships, to express our authentic selves, to fail without cosmic consequences. These are treasures beyond any pharaoh's wealth. We can wake up in the morning and decide how we want to spend our day. We can choose our friends, our partners, our careers. We can make mistakes and learn from them without fearing we've doomed civilization. The pharaoh's tragedy serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth lies not in power or gold, but in the simple human experiences they were denied. The ability to laugh without calculation, to love without political consideration, to dream without supernatural terror, to simply be human rather than perform divinity. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of their story is how their individual personalities, their unique human qualities, their potential for joy and authentic connection, were completely erased by their roles. We know their names, their monuments, their political achievements, but we know almost nothing about who they really were as people. The system that elevated them to godhood simultaneously obliterated their humanity so thoroughly that it's nearly impossible to recover any trace of their authentic selves. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that your ordinary life, with its simple pleasures and everyday freedoms, represents a kind of wealth that no pharaoh ever possessed. You are richer than any ancient king simply by being free to be yourself. So, as we reach the end of our journey through the golden corridors and shadowed chambers of ancient Egypt's most powerful rulers, we're left with a profound understanding of just how deceiving appearances can be. These pharaohs, immortalized in gleaming monuments and revered as living gods, were perhaps the most trapped individuals in their entire civilization. Think about it for a moment. While their subjects could choose their trades, marry for love, speak their minds among friends, and live authentically, the pharaohs were bound by invisible chains stronger than any metal. Every sunrise brought another day of rigid performance. Every meal was a ceremony. Every relationship was political, and every decision carried the weight of cosmic responsibility. Their bodies, weakened by generations of inbreeding and the stress of constant ritual obligations, became prisons of pain. Their minds, isolated from genuine human connection and crushed under supernatural expectations, withered despite their access to the world's greatest luxuries. Even their deaths offered no escape, as their mummified forms were sealed away in elaborate tombs that became their eternal cells. The irony is striking. In a world where they supposedly controlled everything, pharaohs controlled nothing about their own existence. They were slaves to tradition, prisoners of divinity, and victims of their own power. Their tragic stories remind us that true freedom isn't about having dominion over others, but about having agency over your own life. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps in whatever corner of the world you're listening from, remember to appreciate the simple freedoms we often take for granted. The ability to choose our path, to love authentically, to speak our truth, and to simply be human without the crushing weight of divine expectation. If you've enjoyed this journey through the darker side of ancient Egyptian royalty, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be far more peaceful than any pharaoh ever experienced in their golden but gilded existence.